So let's talk about starting an army of lurid power armor, debauched duelists with combat stims, and the demon primarch of Slaanesh, with a few thoughts as to starting Emperor's Children in 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Emperor's Children, and in this video I thought we'd do a general overview of options for starting the faction, a new entry to the roster of Warhammer 40k armies, given fully fledged faction support. In the video let's talk about why you might want to collect Emperor's Children in the first place and some of the pros and cons of them, a few ideas for planning out and starting an army, some thoughts on initial kit purchases to prioritise, and finishing up with one example army list. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. Starting out, why might you want to collect Emperor's Children in the first place? In the lore, they're known as one of the most twisted and depraved of the Chaos Space Marine legions. The all rather debaucherous legion of Fulgrim fall into the temptations of Slaanesh as one of the 4 deity-aligned legions to the great powers of Chaos. They're the 3rd legion of Chaos Space Marines in the heresy, and join Horus's cause to turn against the Emperor, despite being initially rather favoured with the honour of bearing the Emperor's own name and iconography, unlike the rest of the Space Marine legions. Fulgrim and the Emperor's Children were prideful perfectionists, making them perhaps some of the easiest prey for temptation from the Dark Gods, and after their long banishment to the Eye of Terror, the legion is warped beyond all recognition, still having many of their major hallmarks from before, but now thoroughly given in to hedonism and dark desires to experience every sensation out there in the din of battle, lots of them given various different demonic boons from Slaanesh, or having surgical alterations to allow them to take in more sensation, great eye lenses, vox grills, or boosted auditory receptors to allow them to do so, all chased down with a disturbing cocktail of drugs and combat stims. In general, the Legion is one of the more scattered ones as opposed to being a single intact force in 40k, lots of warbands fighting under their own leaders, Fulgrim himself not being much of a unifying figure, having been secluded on a pleasure planet in the Eye of Terror for a number of millennia, and now turning up to the battlefield all rather capriciously, when the fancy might take him one way or the other. When they make war though, they certainly do so in their own distinctive style, often with devastating noise marines with soul-shredding sonic weaponry, peerless duelists, all dialed up to 11 with combat stims and demonic enhancements, and revelling in the depraved carnage that they inflict upon their foes. Miniature-wise, the Emperor's Children have been awaiting for updates for a very long time, now finally getting their own small miniature range for 10th edition, and perhaps having done better than some of the deity legions now. They basically have 7 unique kits, Demon Primarch Fulgrim, 3 character kits with 2 generic ones and Lucius the Eternal, and then 3 infantry kits, one of which is dual build for their troops. Generally their new range has been pretty well received by fans, though compared with the majority of factions in Warhammer 40k, the army roster is really quite a small one. They only have 17 datasheets, beyond their sort of allied demon units that can only be used in one detachment, and only having 8 really unique ones, then some support things from generic Codex Chaos Marines, things like Demon Princes, Rhinos and Land Raiders. People were kind of surprised at just how few things they got from the generic Codex Chaos Marines, missing some things that people expected they would have, such as Hellbrutes, Predators or Cultists. As ever, Chaos miniatures tend to be at least fairly busy with a whole bunch of spikes and trim on them. And if you were looking for a few more options for some themed miniatures, they do have their Emperor's Children miniatures from the Horus Heresy range as well, with a few cool character sculpts, a couple of unique Terminators, and a different rendition of Demon Primarch Fulgrim. As ever in this day and age, there's also the option for 3D printed creations or other sculptors making near proxies. Plenty of cool stuff to find out there from various creators if you do a bit of searching. For a look through their miniature range, here we have the dual build kit for their basic troops. The Tormentors are their sort of legionary equivalents with the Bolters, and then they have some melee equivalents with the Infractors, which have their dueling sabres. Both of those look pretty interesting units in game as well, which is nice. They've got 2 squads of elites, the Flawless Blades, with their all very disturbing Slaaneshi demon boons and mutations, sort of like possessed but more sort of demonic gifts than outright possession. And the new incarnation of Noise Marines, more sort of Chaos Havoc equivalents now with massive amplifiers on their backs, and devastating sonic weapons with screaming demonic faces on them. The Noise Marines are perhaps the most iconic and well-known force out of the Legion. For characters, they've got the Lord Exultant as their sort of generic Chaos Lord equivalent, able to be armed with a fun Phoenix Power Spear, and the Lord Cacophonist with Screamer pistols and a great big Doom Siren on his back, ready to bring the noise in a big way. And then their 2 special characters, Demon Primarch Fulgrim himself making a rather spectacular return to Warhammer 40k, and the new version of Lucius the Eternal, the main leader that they've had in Codex Chaos Space Marines for a very long time now, with his Layer Blade and his Lash of Torment, and rather disturbing lore that if you kill him and revel in your victory, then you'll slowly turn into him. Then to back them up, they've got the generic Chaos Space Marine kits, things like the nice new Demon Prince miniature, which is quite a fun one and has a Slaanesh alternative head. the Mortal Fiend for a bit of dedicated anti-tank close combat punch, and Chaos Rhinos for shipping about your elite infantry, looking quite good for both Noise Marines and Infractors with leaders. Then, as mentioned, they've got their Heresy era range. These generally done as expensive Forge World resin miniatures, though a few of the plastic kits could actually be interesting enough if you're looking to economise. A lot of the Heresy ones get packaged in big box sets, so you might save a bit of money versus the equivalent numbers of Space Marines elsewhere. These could be good options for alternative sculpts for certain leaders or even squad leaders and things. I feel like their Praetor here would make quite a good stand-in for the Lord Exultant perhaps. They also have some fun unique units. The Cacophony could stand in for some Noise Marines, and they have their own Terminator variant as well, which looks a bit more themed than the generic Chaos Space Marine one. And they also have the Heresy era sculpt of Fulgrim Transfigured. He'll be quite a lot more expensive than the plastic one for 40k, though it's a pretty cool model in his own right. As mentioned, there's plenty of options out there for various folks creating cool stuff on the 3D printing scene as well, some of which just so happens to be very appropriate for debauched super soldiers in power armor. One example of those is today's video sponsor in Godforge Minis, basically a 3D printing print-on-demand service based in the USA, and they've got a whole ton of really cool models that you might find useful for various grimdark war games, whether it's one-page rules or 40k. But in particular, they wanted to share a few designs for their rather cool transport vehicle options if you did want to upgrade some plastic kits with a touch of the depraved. For their offerings, they have a light APC conversion kit featuring some very cool side door panels. I believe these are made to work with things like Heresy era Rhinos. Quite a lot of panelling that goes on the base model. They also have a slightly fancier version of that with a whole bunch of flayed skin, a front icon, and some decaying armor panels like that. And then probably their most spectacular offering is this Loud Raider, a whole bunch of upgrades to bring the noise to a mighty adamantine behemoth, adding 1 million speakers and sonic weapons on the sides. I really like the centerpiece stage for this one, an all very disturbing performer, a bunch of speakers and 1 million pipes at the back. It is definitely priced as a bit of a luxury centerpiece item though. And they also have a slightly cheaper, more basic variant as well, this one without the big soundstage. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. You can check them out, links down in the video description below. It's pretty cool to see an example of what 3D printing creators out there are making for them. Getting back to more Games Workshop plastics though, price-wise I'd say the Emperor's Children may be better than most in terms of pricing for getting a 40k army. Just in general, Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines tend to be on the sort of slightly cheaper end of 40k, but obviously that often isn't saying all that much. They tend to be fairly elite, often have more points in the box than some things out there. A fair few of their units that's sitting at the over 2 points per dollar sort of mark, which means that you've got a bit more points for getting any single army for any dollar investment. They're maybe not quite a standout as certain armies like say Grey Knights or Custodians or things. They also don't have quite as many discount deal offerings as the Loyalists tend to. Gameplay-wise, their rules are found in Codex Emperor's Children, first coming out in the launch box and then a more general release. Their playstyle is fast-moving and hard-hitting Space Marines. They're not really super tough per point, very much emphasising the kind of Slaanesh way of doing things there. The core rule really feeding into that with Thrill Seekers, allowing you to advance and charge and advance and shoot, and fall back and shoot and charge, but with some restrictions that you can't attack things that were already attached to this phase or were already in combat at the start of the turn. I do quite like the idea of that, with them sort of getting bored and not wanting to do the same thing twice. Between that and some generally good movement characteristics through the Codex, they can move across the board very quickly indeed. For their playstyle at the moment, they're generally massively more melee slanted versus ranged forces. Noise Marines are definitely an interesting shooting unit, though even they are only 18-inch range, so a more sort of close range fire support than long range big guns. So basically any one army that you build of them is largely going to be melee orientated, potentially almost entirely so if you go light on the Noise Marines. They've got 6 different detachments to choose from, which I'll talk through in brief later. Several of them are at least somewhat general purpose, though a few slant towards certain unit types, emphasising things like transports or characters if you wanted to go heavy on them. For current power, it's very early days at the moment. Given initial points and rules though, it looks like they're certainly not going to be a weak army in Warhammer 40k. Lots of really fast units that hit very hard, but might take at least a little bit of skill and thought to play, given that without big durability, you might well run into problems if you just rush them off the board and get them all shot. Current in-game power probably isn't the thing to focus on though if you're looking to pick up a 40k faction. Games Workshop in 10th edition do have a pretty good record of rebalancing things that get too weak or too strong, and most armies tend to wind up somewhere in the middle over time. In any case, if you want to collect one of 40k's newest factions, with a nice shiny new range of hedonistic thrill seekers and blistering sonic weapons, the Emperor's Children might be for you. If you do choose to pick up the army, There's plenty of ways to find out a bit more information about them. I generally aim to pick up Codex Emperor's Children at least fairly early on. That has the unit profiles, lore and miniature galleries from Games Workshop, so it's quite a nice place to start, and quite good to have them explored actually in dedicated form in their own book. There's a huge amount of lore in novels, particularly from the vast Horus Heresy series. Plenty of novels featuring the Emperor's Children in particular. In general, the Space Marine Legions tend to have really quite detailed backstories compared with a bunch of factions out there. For messing around with army lists, there's things like Battlescribe, New Recruit, Warhapedia, or Games Workshop's app for rules and army lists. When they update, they'll be good to do a bit of theory crafting. You can always use Tabletop Simulator or proxying models to try out an army before you go out and spend loads of money on it, just to make sure that you do actually like the feel of them in game. And here on YouTube there's a load of content as well. I made a fair few Emperor's Children videos over the past week or so, including a Codex review, unit tier list, and a bunch of other unit reviews. I'll link a couple of those down in the video description below. There's also a massive amount of other contents out there, battle reports, painting guides and all sorts of lore on other channels, plus plenty of other takes on the Codex. Finally, it can be worth following along with one of the dedicated Emperor's Children sites, either things like Discord servers, Facebook groups or subreddits, wherever you get your social media. It can just be nice to see what other people are talking about or sharing, and also be a place to ask a few basic questions from experienced hobbyists. When planning an army, it's probably worth thinking about what sort of army you'd actually like to wind up with. You could plan out a rough 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list just to give you an idea as to where you might be heading, and is that the army that you'd like to see on the tabletop once you get there. It doesn't necessarily have to be any sort of hard and fast plan, but might just help focus your ideas a little bit for where you go. Given it's a faction with a relatively small miniature range, particularly so of their unique kits, I feel like most players are going to build at least fairly balanced for Emperor's Children, adding the units they take a shine to or work well in game, and just getting a copy or two of their unique units plus the supporting Chaos Space Marine datasheets that appeal really isn't the worst idea in the world. If you wanted to do something a little bit different and more dedicated, you could theme to a certain detachment, say going transport heavy, do a dedicated melee force, focus on the Noise Marines, or building around the Allied Demon detachment. I'd bear in mind though that individual detachment rules like that are probably less likely to stick around in their current form for the extreme long term in Warhammer 40K. Games Workshop is likely to shake things up in some major or minor ways each edition. Alternatively, you could build up from a very lore-driven perspective, perhaps building around one Chaos Warlord to lead your warbands, giving them their own personality and eclectic preferences, maybe dictating which units you use and how you tend to use them. At the moment you could take allies as well, maybe things like Chaos Knights, though bear in mind they do have a Codex coming out in the not too distant future which might potentially upend allied rules. Games Workshop do tend to change them around quite a bit, and demons look like they're only going to be fielded in their one detachment, making them maybe a little bit frustrating and not quite as easy just to add some in without going big on actually focusing on that one detachment. But that's definitely something that you could do. Again, bear in mind that that's more likely to be unusually changed by addition changes when Games Workshop shakes things up with allies rules. Talking of detachments though, if you did want to try and plan around one of these, there's 6 different ones in the Emperor's Children Codex. The Coterie of the Conceited basically has you build up a kill tally with more and more damage boosts as your unit slays more enemy units. That's quite a fun one, though it might take a few turns to really get going with the big damage boosts. Slaanesh Chosen means that you'll want to have loads of characters trying to outdo each other for the favour of their patron. The Mercurial Host is nice and general purpose and speed focused. Basically all the units enjoy being able to get into the fight even faster. Rapid Evisceration is the transport detachment, probably going to be fielding lots of rhinos and a land raider if you want to make that work maximally. It can be quite a nice one for Noise Marines as well. Peerless Bladesman maybe feels like one of the easiest ones to use. Most of the army is very melee focused and this gives you some very direct melee damage support, sustained hits on the charge and things like that, and I feel like this one might be an easy pick for a lot of people out there. And then the Carnival of Excess is the one with allied demons allowed, allowing you to take half your army in the 5 demon datasheets in the Codex, and then the Emperor's Children and demons both get advantages when they're fighting side by side. Perhaps the other thing to plan when dreaming up an army is to paint up a test model as well. Maybe a Tormentor, Infractor or Noise Marine could be a good place to start. Relatively representative of the faction and a lower investment versus a massive great big character or vehicle. And that way you can test out the colour scheme, decide if you like the way that it looks or not, and then maybe redo and have another go if it's really not quite what you envisaged. You could try and match Games Workshop's more standard box art colour theme. That tends to be kind of lurid pink with black mixed in. But there's a whole ton of different ways that you could paint up your miniatures. You could go for the rather striking purple and gold Heresy era scheme that they have, one of the various warbands from the lore, or make up your own. Generally, Chaos Space Marines in general tend to be at least fairly time consuming to paint up and hit the table, unfortunately. They do often tend to have a lot of trim and fancy bits to go around in metal around about the armour plates. If you really wanted to save time a bit, you could consider going for a colour scheme where that doesn't have to be painted in a different colour, though it does mean that you lose a bit of contrast and complexity on the model. There's a whole bunch of cool painting guides here on YouTube, including a lot of people making content for the new miniatures that came out. Games Workshop seem to have done fairly well with a couple of really quite cool painting tutorials for the new models, showcasing how to paint a whole bunch of them in different colour schemes in contrast paints, which I thought was fun. Getting on to actual model purchases though. For the ones that I'd think about starting Emperor's Children with, I'd either go for the Champions of Slaanesh box set if you can find one, which unfortunately Games Workshop hasn't made easy. Go for the Combat Patrol for Emperor's Children, which is currently on release at time of recording but shouldn't be too long away. Or if you just wanted to dip a toe in the faction and paint up some miniatures before committing to a big box, then maybe go for a set of either Noise Marines or perhaps Tormentors or Infractors. Focusing on the discount deals first up here's the Combat Patrol for Emperor's Children. This one's led by the Lord Exultant, 2 units of 3 flawless blades, and then a unit of 10 other troops which can either be built as the melee or more ranged variants. The price on the Combat Patrol box set will be £100, $170 or €130, and discount on buying the box sets individually will be around about 30%ish, which does look fairly in line with the Games Workshop standard for Combat Patrol box sets for 10th edition. In terms of points in the box, there's around about 470 points here, around about 2.8 points per dollar is okay as far as Warhammer goes. There's definitely Combat Patrol box sets that are less than 300 points out there, so this one is a bit better by comparison than some. I'd say for criticisms, it doesn't exactly have the most models in the world at only 17 of them. Even if 7 of them are at least fairly elite, I'd guess that it might not be one that too many people would get 2 copies of just due to going very heavy on the flawless blades. You need to be wanting 12 of those in an army overall, and might also appeal less to people who've picked up the Champions of Slaanesh box set, as by that point you're getting on for a pretty massive amount of the base troops. If I was starting an Emperor's Children army though, I'd absolutely pick up 1 copy of this. The models are pretty useful in game, and the discount I think is enough to be tempting. When picking up Warhammer 40k miniatures in general, if you're new to the game, it's certainly worth knowing the different ways in which you can pick things up. You can buy directly from Games Workshop's own Warhammer web store, which is generally the most reliable but also the most expensive way to pick up expensive plastic. In general, when I tend to pick things up, it tends to be from local gaming stores or online discount retailers that sell the exact same things officially, but around about 10 to 20% cheaper around the world. I've got a whole bunch of those linked down in the video description. Element Games for 15% off in the UK, Gap Games for 21% off in Australia, Fenris Workshop for saving 10% in Canada, Wargame Portal for 15% in the USA, and Tash and Geldeep for 16 to 20% off in Germany and the EU. Loads of other good examples if you just Google discount Warhammer and add in your country name of course, but those ones specifically help to support the channel with any purchases made after clicking the links in the video description, so a massive thank you for anyone supporting via them. Otherwise, the other options are the second-hand market as well. eBay can often be worth a look if you're picking up any one individual unit, perhaps more useful for the Emperor's Children for more generic chaos-based running things that have been around a while, maybe looking for stuff like Land Raiders or Rhinos going a bit cheaper. Sometimes it can save a fair bit of money, and also potentially a bit of time and effort as well. If the kit's already assembled and has been well treated, quality can definitely be variable though. It seems a bit less likely that as a new range there'll be some of the new models going on eBay for reasonable prices for a while yet, though we might see a few people selling things individually from the big box set if they say had too many copies of one unit, so some of those might be going a little bit cheaper than otherwise around the world in the initial launch phase. As mentioned, 3D printing and third-party manufacturers also exist as well. Lots of great alternative sculpts out there, some of them at more sort of prestige centerpieces, and some of them quite good for economizing and saving some money. They can potentially be nice for some shoulder pad heraldry and things. As mentioned, feel free to check out the video sponsor linked in the video description for those fancy parts that can go on Rhinos and Land Raiders. Otherwise, beyond the Combat Patrol, it's worth talking about the other big discount box, the launch box for the faction in the Champions of Slaanesh, which I think really is quite a good deal for starting the army, but unfortunately Games Workshop didn't really make many copies of it, so it seems that a bunch of people have been disappointed when they tried to pick it up around the world. This one contains a Lord Exultant, 2 sets of the troops, 2 sets of 6 Noise Marines, the Codex with a limited edition cover, plus the datasheet cards. Its on-sale price was £145, $230 or €180, and at that price it's around about a 40% discount or so. But bear in mind it's only a discount if it is selling for a reasonable price rather than being scalped to high heaven. There's 690 points worth of miniatures in the box, so around about 3 points per dollar if you can find it for the original sale price. Though as mentioned, Games Workshop unfortunately seemed to make really quite a few of them, and they sold out really fast in both the USA and Canada and the UK and EU. so not very helpful for people wanting to jump into the faction in a big way. At time of recording and video release, it hasn't been so long since the pre-order, so feel free to give a shout out to any places in which you can pick it up for budding Emperor's Children hobbyists. For other options to pick up, there should be a bunch of physical copies going to the brick and mortar Warhammer stores around the world on the 15th of March. That could be one option to buy direct from Games Workshop itself if you have one of those convenient for you, though I don't know how fast they'll sell out there. It seems like there's probably been at least fairly good supply in Australia, so probably not going to be an issue picking it up if you live there. And taking a look at the channel affiliate discount retailers, it still seems that Taschengeldieb still seems to have some, at least of the German set, in Germany, so that could be one option if you live there. Certainly a bit frustrating though, given that it was quite a good launch box set to get into the faction, and a lot more people seem to want one than had the opportunity to pick one up. Otherwise though, let's talk through the units and kits with their role in game and thoughts on buying and assembling them. First up, as mentioned, I will be tempted to pick up the Codex. A bunch of people will get them in the Champions of Slaanesh box sets, and there might be a few going on eBay for them. I would guess probably not at particularly reasonable prices given that the supply of the box set was low. Otherwise, there's the more mainstream Codex cover here that'll be around about the $60 or £37 sort of mark, and Games Workshop does also have this ridiculously fancy Fulgrim cover one that a fair few collectors do seem to be tempted to pick up, though I can only imagine that the price on this is going to be absolutely astronomical. Talking through the units, I feel like a lot of people will be picking up their Tormentors and Infractors from either the Champions of Slaanesh box or the Combat Patrol. Both of these units seem really quite good. For the Infractors, they move fast and scout and mess up light infantry. I put them with a Lord Exultant, maybe in a Rhino, and have them scout up the board and hit something very, very hard in the mid-board. They get some nice re-rolls against things in melee. For the Tormentors, I feel like these are basically auto-include for the Emperor's Children, maybe 2 small units of 5. They're only cheap at 85 points for 5 Space Marines with OC2. They infiltrate to start in the mid-board and have the sticky objectives rule, and that just means that they're going to give a decent leg up on winning the mission in general, and they can both take a plasma gun and a melter gun per squad of 5 of them, plus a plasma pistol on the sergeant. I wouldn't go too heavy or give them loads of support given that they just pay a premium for their cool abilities, but they definitely seem like a fun and worthwhile unit worth having. The Noise Marines are the main fire support unit at 18-inch range. They're available either in that Champions box or will be sold in box sets of 6. They're a close-range fire support unit at 18-inch range that generally is best against elite infantry as opposed to being particularly great against really tough vehicles and monsters. The Blastmasters are definitely the focal thing in the unit, and I'd absolutely build both of them, and Rhinos seem like a pretty reasonable way to deliver them into threat range. Flawless Blades are the elite melee infantry, 110 points per 3 of them, moving pretty fast and then having their big hitting but big risk demonic patrons type rule where they can wound everything on a 3+, and that just means they're guaranteed to make a lot of damage on whatever they hit. I'd probably be more tempted to field them in units of 6 just to reduce the chance of them falling short of killing the unit that they went into, and they do seem extra nice for the detachments that can give them some easy damage buffs such as Peerless Bladesmen. They're really not all that tough though, and maybe have a bit of danger of just hitting something and then dying. I feel like these guys are the sort of things that you might be able to convert from certain other Chaos Space Marine miniatures out there as well. Perhaps with spare parts from a set you might be able to kit bash some possessed into some more of them. Fulgrim himself seems like a really powerful and interesting datasheet, though doesn't seem outright auto-include, at least for first impressions. I guess we'll see. I feel like the majority of people looking to jump into Emperor's Children probably will get their Primarch though, given he's quite such a cool and focal centerpiece miniature. He moves very fast, hits very hard, and fights first is going to make him a massive great big problem for melee armies. He definitely seems fun enough to put on the table. Lucius the Eternal does seem like a very strong datasheet, 140 points for an incredibly tanky lone operative. He then moves fast, has fights first, and hits incredibly hard in close combat, getting big rerolls against certain tough things and characters. Feels like it's hard to go wrong with a lone operative utility backed up by some massive melee damage when it makes sense to commit him to the fight. The Lord Exultant feels like one of the biggest close combat threats. He just works incredibly well with a unit of Infractors. You scout them up the board and then have a really big threat range with the Thrill Seekers rule. I'd personally give him the Phoenix Power Spear with a Rapture Lash based on the current rules. That gives him a whole load of scary melee attacks. And when he activates his big Euphoric Strikes rule and charges something on the mid-board objectives with all his lethal hits and things, he's going to be a massive threat to literally anything, particularly if you've got other synergies that you could give him, particularly such as a Fighty Enhancement. The enhancements that give him +1 damage are absolutely god tier on him. Even without an enhancement though, his damage output with 10 Infractors is really something to behold. Feels like with running with 5 is fairly equally viable as well. He definitely does the most work, and not bad given that that's a scouting unit of OC2 troops that's definitely a bit of a weight on objectives as well. Finally, fairly unique options, they've got the Lord Cacophonist. At 60 points, he's just a fairly efficient datasheet, including being surprisingly tanky for his cost as well, with sort of Terminator-style stat lines. He seems absolutely reasonable to amplify the damage of a Noise Marine unit, maybe being deployed by a Rhino. At 60 points seems interesting enough that you could even run him solo as well, being one of the single cheapest Emperor's Children units that you can field, and still having enough interesting threat in his own right between those Screamer Pistols and Doom Siren to make his presence felt. Otherwise, for options to expand, I'd certainly be tempted to pick up a Chaos Rhino or two to transport the Infractors or the Noise Marines to get the strikes on the enemy. Their advance and drop rule is particularly nice for the Noise Marines in this army, and they can be quite nice disruptive units with Thrill Seekers built in. Morphines are a pretty good anti-tank option, again moving very fast and hitting nice and hard. I quite enjoy Peerless Bladesman for the extra melee damage buff amongst others. Chaos Terminators can be a good way to get quite a lot of points on the board for not that much money investment. I'd probably field them with Maximal Power Fist if I was going to. I feel like they may be a little bit undertuned versus a couple of the other melee options in the army, though some people might find ways to make them work well, of course. I do kind of wonder if in the long run Games Workshop might update the Emperor's Children with their own Terminator variant though that could be years and years away at the moment. Finally, the Demon Prince variant seem very playable for the Emperor's Children at the moment. Both the winged one and the on-foot one seem fine. My personal favourite is probably the winged one with his -1 damage and big mortal wound impact hits, and he can be kind of fun with enhancements as well. He's a bit more generic chaos flavoured, but as mentioned he does have a Slaanesh head swap, and is also quite a recent fun model as well. Finally, while we're on kit options, I'd bear in mind that there's some cheaper options for Chaos Space Marines in the Horus Heresy range. If you're looking to economise and quite like Heresy-style power armour, then that could be one option for getting some cheaper models in the army. The Age of Darkness box set could be one option, even if the Contemptor Dreadnought doesn't have current rules in the Codex, unfortunately. I guess you could perhaps proxy as an on-foot Demon Prince in a pinch. It is rather heavy on the Bolter Marine variants for what you'd want for Tormentors though in the army, which could be one downside to the starter kit. You'd probably need to resell a bunch. Just in general though, it could be interesting to look for say the Legion Tactical Squads or the Terminators if wanting Heresy era plates, and a few more Terminators than your money versus buying the generic Chaos kit. I feel like Chaos Marines in general do look rather striking with some Heresy era armour marks mixed in. In general though, my first thought would be to pick up one of the discount kits, probably the Combat Patrol or the Champions of Slaanesh box set if you do have that option available to you, and then expand from there, largely by feels on which units you either like the look of or feel like you'd be putting on the table all the time. At first impressions, I'd say that pretty much every unit in the Codex does seem really quite usable. Maybe the most overshadowed could be the Helldrake with its kind of limited damage unless you happen to be facing off against fly units, or the Chaos Sorcerer, which just doesn't seem like it's the best choice versus either of the Lord options. And as mentioned, the Chaos Demon datasheets do feel a little bit depressingly limited. I'd probably only go into them big if you really want to try and make that unique detachment work. Beyond that though, everything else seems like it's decently strong and has its own niche and draws to fielding it. I'd likely build up a balanced core of the army, probably trying to aim to get one copy of at least each of their unique units, maybe build up to 2 of them for a few. Things like Noise Marines and Flawless Blades, and maybe a couple of Lord Exultants could be reasonable enough, and then add the supporting Chaos datasheets that seem to work best for the army at the time. All the ones mentioned seem absolutely fine, particularly the Rhinos, also the Demon Princes, Mauler Fiends, and Chaos Spawn as well, although you could think about kit bashing them. For going for current in-game power though, probably the top priorities would be to get a couple of units of Tormentors and at least some Infractors with an Exultant, probably in a Rhino. And I feel like Lucius the Eternal also seems like a great lone operative that's going to be kind of impossible to go too far wrong with if played carefully. Beyond that core though, I feel like genuinely most of the rest has some pretty interesting options depending on the detachment or your preferences, and certainly in a more casual, less hyper-optimised setting. For the detachments, I'll certainly be interested to see what's going to get embraced by the tournament scene more generally. Just at first impressions, maybe the Peerless Bladesman and the Mercurial Host both seem like they affect the vast majority of the army in helping them out, and maybe seem just general purpose easy wins, particularly the Bladesman one with its boosted damage. The Transport one could be one to look at if you're really trying to get the most out of Noise Marines, and the Coterie of the Conceited seems pretty fun as well, though maybe a bit over-dependent on trying to get those early kills in, otherwise the detachment rule doesn't function properly. Will certainly be cool to see what people make of army lists. Just for an initial impression though, here's one example of a starter list idea. Roughly 2,000 points, though not 100% exact, more for a bit more general idea and flavour. And my idea behind this one was getting a Combat Patrol box set and one of the Champions box sets, and then one copy of each of the characters in Lucius, Fulgrim and the Lord Cacophonist, and then going from there. Feels like that will give you a fairly balanced force that would at least be pretty interesting in a number of the different detachments really. For this one we've got the unique characters going solo and just doing what they're doing. The Lord Exultants both take the Phoenix Spear and Rupture Lash, and we'll go with Infractors. There's a 10-man one in a Rhino, and another 5-man one lurking as a threat to charge out at things in the midfield from behind terrain. There's 2 units of Noise Marines, one with a Lord Cacophonist will hitch a ride in the other Rhino, and the other one might go into strategic reserves, or again be a sort of hide behind terrain sort of threat, or even do some transport shenanigans jumping into the Rhino when another unit gets out. There's a Winged Demon Prince that could either rush up the board and hit things very hard with a bunch of mortal wounds, or potentially be a rapid ingress threat to drop down and then get the charge hopefully at full health. And then there's a unit of 6 Flawless Blades, these guys just starting on the board, and again trying to lurk behind terrain before getting the jump on something big. Hopefully with 6 of them all in one squad, they should be a good option for using any buffs or stratagems on, and should have a good chance of killing something even if it's a massive great big tough monster and vehicle if they need to activate their 3+ to wound. Hopefully that should be at least a fairly strong and balanced list using a bunch of the unique units, and feels like it could be relevant enough for a bunch of different detachments, even if it's not super tailoring to any one of them. In any case though, look forward to hearing your thoughts as to starting Emperor's Children. Hopefully the video's given you a few ideas, though feel free to share any other insights or thoughts down in the comments below. As mentioned, feel free to check out my other videos on the channel. I've made an Emperor's Children tier list and a Codex overview. I'll link those down below if you'd like to check either of those out. Finally, a big thank you to Godforge Minis for sponsoring the video. If you want to take a look at their rather fancy looking upgrade kits, feel free to take a look at them, linked down in the video description, amongst all their other fun stuff that they have. I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.